Good morning, everybody. For today's guest, and I want to introduce you to her because she actually does something very unique. And well, I'm not sure if it's unique in the sense of the actual um, uh, arena that she works in, but in terms of celebrating life, I just wanted to bring her on because I feel that this is something that's really important to address when people lose a loved one in terms of celebrating one's life. So the person that I'm going to introduce you to is Bridget Halfyard. She's from the West Coast, and I am so grateful that she's here. So let's get this conversation started in terms of what a funeral celebrant is. So let's bring you on. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks.
Before we start, of course, because I was so intrigued by what you do, and I felt it was such an important thing. Before we do get into that, can you tell us a little bit about your life story of how you got to doing what you're doing?
Okay, sure. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, officially in this capacity, but for years I've been interested in helping people get through grieving processes, different kind of grief. I worked in a school as a chaplain for many years, and as you know, in a school, sometimes kids die as well, and so I've had some good experience where I've had to help large groups of people grieve the death of a loved one. And so from that, I was doing that when I lived in Ontario, and then I've moved to Alberta. And in that transition, getting a little bit older, I thought I really wanted to dive into dealing a little more with grief and funeral type services. So I went to Mount Royal University and did my funeral director studies. So I became a licensed funeral director here in the province of Alberta. And then to coincide with that, I wanted to take it a step further because I really wanted to work deeply with families. So I did a training to become a funeral celebrant. And it all kind of really started when I started working in the funeral home, and I was in the back. There was a deceased who had come in, and he was, I don't know, he was somewhere in his 80s. And I was just looking at him, and I'd seen lots of other people come through who had been deceased, and we go through the process. But for some reason, this gentleman just struck the curiosity in my heart, and I'm looking at him because there was no visitation, there was no funeral service. He died. He was brought to us. He's going right to the crematorium, and I just thought, he has a story. I would love to know about this man, and nobody's going to hear his story. And I just thought, just so many questions came up. Who is he? Who are his kids? Who is his family? Who is his mom that hugged him when he was a little toddler running around? And so that really sparked me to begin to become a celebrant.
And so, in terms of being a celebrant, is that something that is attached to a funeral home? Is that something that you hire somebody separate to do that portion when you're having a funeral?
It can be both. Generally, when someone passes away and you go in and you do your arrangement to do the arrangements for the funeral for the deceased, if you're going to have a service, then the funeral director will contact a funeral celebrant or a minister. The trend these days is that people won't have any type of service because they don't belong to a church. And they think, well, if I don't belong to a church, I can't have a service. But that's something that I'm really trying to change people's perspective on, that you can have a service. It doesn't have to be in a church. It still can be, for sure. But if you're not particularly involved in a particular church, you can have a service that still has a religious dimension to it, or no religious dimension to it, but still celebrating the story of the deceased. And so the funeral director would speak with the family about that. And if they think that they want to go with a funeral celebrant, then the funeral director would call me and hire me directly. So that's one way. The other way is through my website. If it's kind of after the fact, especially right now, a lot of people during COVID have put their funerals off, or they said they just couldn't do one at the time, but that now they want to do something once things start opening up, then they can hire me, just hire me through my website. And so
Right.
it kind of works both ways.
Right. And again, I want to, so there's a couple of points there. So it's non-denominational, meaning it doesn't have to be religious based, right? It's more about celebrating that life from the parents, I mean, the people's perspective of what they want out of get that particular, I don't know, what would you call it? Like a gathering?
Yeah, we call it a service or a ceremony.
Right.
And so what happens with me is if I'm hired or contacted by the family, I will go and meet with the family and spend between 1 and 2 hours. And that is the most precious time for me. I love hearing stories of their loved one. They tell me all different stories from whoever's present. And then I just take tons of notes, and then I build my service based on the things that they have told me. And in those meetings, that's when I can really get a sense of the people who I get a sense of the deceased by their loved ones and the stories they share. If they've had a sense of humor, if they do have a favorite prayer, if they do have a favorite poem, so I can kind of get a sense of if they want, a little bit of religious connotation to it or none at all.
Right.
And so then we just build the service from there. And it's
and it sounds like it's very personalized, right? Depending on what the family wants, what the stories are, and you make it so that it's very personalized to the family. And then I wanted to touch on how this helps them, like, because you initially started out with our talk saying, the whole idea of people going through grief, right, from a death. Then how does that help them in terms of, having this process?
Well, I really believe some type of ceremony to celebrate their life or to remember their life is really important. And I bring in different components to the service that can help them take things forward. So recently I did a service for a 17-year-old boy who had passed away, and he loved puzzles and he loved wolves. Two things. So I incorporated those two things into the service. And during the service, I had brought a wolf puzzle. And so I laid out all the pieces in different baskets, and we passed out these baskets, and people could take, a handful of the puzzle pieces to take home with them. And I related that to, to hand out each of these pieces to different people in your own wolf pack. So people travel in wolves. So who's in your wolf pack, and who's important in your life? And so some of the parents went home and gave these puzzle pieces to their kids and spoke about, who is it that's in your life, that's in your wolf pack, that's important to you. So it was a good way to open up discussion for other families and especially young kids, and for parents to know who their kids are connected with. Right. And also as adults, like, who's in your wolf pack, who's important to you when stuff starts getting tough, where do you go? Right. And I think having good community is really important. So when you are grieving, have good community around you. And, it's been so incredibly difficult during COVID, because people haven't been able to have people around them. So their grief is just compounding itself. And it's almost like it's a fractured grief, because they're holding on, they're waiting maybe to have a service, waiting to get hugs from family members, just waiting. You're waiting with your grief. And that is one of the basic things we try not to do, address the grief as soon as you can, because more grief will come. As you know, everyone suffers with different types of grief. And, one death might, death of an aunt might be, traumatic, but not that hard. But then, next year a parent dies, and you haven't dealt with the first grief. So the second grief just, you have such a difficult time handling it. So address the grief as soon as you can is something. And in doing things like handing out those puzzle pieces, it was an opportunity for people to really talk about it and address that grief.
Right. And I think that's the thing, right? When you have their story, when you've spent time, a couple of hours with the family, figuring it out of what was important, what was that person's story, and then when you have a person like you who can actually give it some sort of framework around presenting it, about making sure that it touches the family in a very profound way, because it that person meant so much to them, that their story is going to live on with them. And I think that's so powerful, right? In terms of just going through that grieving process, to be able to give it that voice. So you actually brought something up that was, because of COVID, a lot of people haven't been able to, either have those ceremonies or those services, or that they are still kind of in a holding pattern of holding their grief. So how right now are you supporting those that perhaps are feeling that, or in your business, how are you pivoting your business for with COVID and all of the restrictions?
Some of the way that I do things, when I normally would go to a family's home and meet with them, now things in Alberta are opening up a little bit more than in Ontario, so we could meet outside on a back patio, still staying distanced apart. The other thing is, like what we're doing right now, just on Zoom or on Facebook, just different video formats where we can connect, or with some I've had to actually just do it over the phone. So that's been a real challenge, because it's tougher to get a sense of who the whole family is when you're on speakerphone with several people. So, but it's made me work harder and made me work at a way where I've had to adjust some of my questions to make sure that I'm really getting a sense of who the people are. And then when we get to service, it's been challenging, because that's the first time I meet the people now. So there's a different dimension. And then during the service, if it's indoors, even outdoors, most people have had to have limited people. So even if they're allowed to have 15 people, sometimes they have to stop at 8, because once they add that one more who's not, the immediate family, like where do you draw the line?
Right.
So it's been so painful to watch people have to make those decisions. Yeah. The other thing that lots of funeral homes are doing, and myself, is to provide a webcast of some type. So a funeral where there's only 8 people inside the chapel, there might be 50 people on Skype or on Zoom who are participating in the service as well and watching it. So what I try to do is reach out to them as well. And one simple way that's been very meaningful is to for family members who are present with me to light a candle. But at the same time, I've asked everyone else to, go somewhere in your house, find a candle or a lighter or something, and hold that light with us as well. So in solidarity, wherever they are, in the country or around the world, they can still join us in that way.
Yeah. And that's important, right? When people aren't able to gather. But even when I think about it, like for people that are across the country, let's say, right? So even if there was 50 people, if we were allowed at this point, no, but 50 people in a room, but yet with technology, you could actually include others from around the globe, really, to make sure that the family is coming together and has the support of everybody. So I think it's a really important part of the grieving process, is to be able to walk them through that in a way that they are feeling supported and loved by their loved ones. And then the fact that you create a story around the person that's died gives them that more meaningful way of celebrating that life. So I want to talk, I guess I want to just alter the conversation a little bit about just you being an entrepreneur. Now you've started this, and how did it all come about in terms of did you just right away go on your own? I know you touched on it a little bit, but how did that happen?
Well, I was a licensed, or I am a licensed funeral director in the province of Alberta. And so I was doing that, and then that's when I saw that man, and I, I have to do something else. So then I did a training through Insight. Uh, Insight is a company. They're from the States, but they travel all over North America and do trainings to train people in learning to be a celebrant. So I did my certified training with them. So it began to really enhance my work as a funeral director, because I had this, just kind of a different angle at looking at families when I'm meeting with them, and in order to try and support and share with people that you can have a service, and it's important to have a service. And one person who's a funeral director who's an influence on me is actually from where you're from, in Orangeville. Abby Gauthier, he works at Dodds and McNair. I have some Orangeville roots. My husband is from there, and I have lots of family there.
It's a small world.
Yeah, a very small world. And when I first started doing funeral training, and at the same time, we were also, I was grieving the death of my stepdaughter, who had passed away when she was 23, just 5 years ago. And he kept saying to me, if you're going to get into this work, you have to help people to learn to celebrate and learn to do a service. Make sure they have some type of ceremony to acknowledge that person who has died. And he was so passionate about it. And I really look up to him as someone. He's been in the business for his whole life, and he's older than me, so it's been a long time. So so I really took that to heart, and that was something. These things collide. I'm in the funeral home, and like people, would get so much healing out of having some type of service. It's really hard to do, and I recognize that it's really hard to be able to go and address your grief and address the fact that someone has died. People kind of just want to not have a service and go away from it. But there's so much healing when you can be there, when you can be there with other people, when you can participate. And that's something that I really try to encourage, some of the family members, children or grandkids of the deceased, or brothers or sisters. If there's a poem, instead of me doing all the talking, I try to get them to prepare something, at least, or a tribute. It's often a eulogy that someone will do, so that they're not just listening to the stories from me, but they're listening to the stories from the people who have spent that time with the deceased. And then I found those people who do participate, there's so much healing in it. Like they just feel proud that I was able to honor, my loved one by being able to stand up in front of people when they're shaking, scared, grieving, but still get up and do that has been pretty powerful.
Right. So, and I guess that's part of so as an entrepreneur, you really tapped into knowing what the problem was that you're trying to solve for them, right? The idea of helping them through that grieving, even though some of it is uncomfortable, is actually going to get them a few steps ahead in terms of moving on and acknowledging that they're going through this grief. I think that's instead of sort of putting it under the carpet and saying, let's just move away from this feeling because I don't like it, right? Yeah. So as an entrepreneur, and I know that, it has been difficult because of, the fact that you couldn't meet people. So you've pivoted some of the things online. As an entrepreneur that's watching this, or some of my viewership is people that are looking at entrepreneurship, what would you kind of say to them when you started your journey and the things you learned? What would you say if they're just at the beginning stages of really following a passion that they really want to do?
Communicate with people. Communication is so key, and find the forum that works for you. Some people, Facebook Live works great for them. Some people, writing a blog works for them. But communicate. You have to let people know what you're doing. You have to let people know your passion. Why are you passionate about that? And in sharing your story of why you do what you do will really show your passion. And when you're passionate about something, people will gravitate towards that. So I try to look at other celebrants who have been doing this for years, and what are they doing? What makes them passionate about it. So communicate with people in your own, whatever area of your business is. Communicate with other people and learn as much as you can from people who have been doing it already. So communicate is a huge thing for me, and sharing what you do. So communicate with people to learn, but then share what you do. So write a blog or write a story about grief. Sharing grief on, my own personal story of grief I've shared on my website of, how I've been able to get through things as someone who grieves has been important to, it makes it important for other people to know that, okay, this person knows what they're doing.
Right.
So what's your personal story that drives your passion, and then communicate it.
Right. And I think that's the key, right? Is typically speaking, people that are passionate about something is because they've gone through it themselves, and they've had a challenge or an adversity that really brings them on the other side to say, now I can share this story because I've come over this hurdle and can help others who are perhaps going through it. And I think that idea of sharing your story is so powerful because everybody can relate to a story from their perspective. Even though it's your story, if I read it, then I would be able to put myself in it from different angles, and it gives that, like, your story a life to me, right? So I think in terms of business owners, it's really important to have our stories and like you said, communicate them, share them, because then people will realize the authenticity that you're showing up with. You're being vulnerable by sharing a story, and it gives them the ability to really lean into you for advice or for help or whatever that is, whatever the service is that's being provided. So this has been really, like, for me, as I spoke to you before the interview, I really didn't know a lot about what a funeral celebrant was and how it all kind of tied in. And this has been extremely helpful because I think just the idea of celebrating a life of someone that's deceased, especially like if you're, so I told you, like, my father passed away 14 years ago, and there was a process that we go through, and Muslims do it a little bit different in terms of a funeral, but I think it would have been good for the family to have a celebration of his life, to be able to give everybody a voice, because a father figure has a lot of different angles within the family, as a grandfather, a father, a husband, an uncle, all of that, right? So I think the fact that you put a story to it is beautiful. I just want to thank you for accepting the invitation to coming and talking about it. We've had quite a few comments. A lot of your people that adore you are on here watching and supporting you. So I just want to thank you. And if there's any questions if anybody wanted to reach out to you, I guess, would they be able to go on your website and have your contact information there?
Yep. Yeah. Just go to my website, check it out. Send me an email. My phone number should be on there as well. If you need to talk about a direction you want to go in with grief, I don't care where you live. If you live in Ontario and you still need to talk to someone, just be conscious of the time change for Alberta. I'm willing to help direct people in any way, even if they're not using me as a celebrant. I'm really passionate about helping people to address their grief.
That's amazing. And I think just for you being who you are and wanting to help, I think people can just kind of feel that way, that they would be able to trust in having that conversation with you. So I want to thank you for your time. If anybody, like I said, if anybody wants to reach out, please note the website down, and you can contact Bridget directly. Bridget, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. And I hope that we can continue our connection with more conversations. Absolutely. It's been my honor. Thank you. So I hope you enjoyed that. This is something that, we all have to deal with at some point. That is one thing. Death is one thing that's guaranteed in terms of our life. And so as hard as it is as a topic, I hope that Bridget was able to bring some form of a way of celebrating and a way of maybe dealing with grief differently. So I hope this helped you. And if there's any questions, please contact Bridget directly. If you have any questions for me, you can always get a hold of me on Facebook. So wishing you a wonderful, happy, blessed Tuesday. Be kind to yourself and others. I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m.